HS358D students, this is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 6. Yay, we're in week 6. And with being in week 6, we're also now moving into the next phase of the writing assignment project, which is peer review and assessment. I've already managed to go through Moodle and assign folks um, different essays for them to review and assess and give feedback to between now and next in the end of this week, and the day on Sunday, October the 16th. Thank you for all of those who did submit their um, essays on time, whatever kind of essay they're doing. Um, about a quarter of you, about a quarter of the classes, as the case may be, sections, have not submitted. I've heard from a bunch of you about why, illnesses, issues. Maybe you tried to do it last minute, realized that this isn't a last minute assignment, which I told you right from the get go wasn't, that kind of thing. So there's that. Um, Keep in mind you're not being penalized, right? This is process work. There are hard deadlines October the 23rd, so do not feel like you're going to lose points for this. I'm not specifically going to take into account that, oh, you didn't submit this on time. Just get it done. If you can't get it done, you've already contacted me about why you can't get it done. And I'm accommodating people who have, illnesses and other issues where they can't, where they can't actually get it done in a timely manner. But short of that, get it in as soon as you can. So there's that. Um, I don't really have anything much to say about the process because we've already discussed it. Um, I know some of you, again, probably, it's like pulling teeth to get you to do anything in a timely manner, but this process is designed so that you do not have to sit down at the last minute and just vomit on a piece of paper, Jackson Pollock on a piece of paper, a whole bunch of words that might not be helpful to you. This is to cut down on that so that you're in fact are turning in a polished final draft with me by the 23rd of October. So keep that in mind. And really, it's for you to have the sense of independence and independent thinking that really is part of the college experience. I mean, you want to come out of college being able to think enough for yourself to where it's not, all because your peers say this is the way it's supposed to be, you're supposed to just go with that, or where your parents say it's supposed to be, you're just supposed to go with that, or where your church or synagogue or mosque or temple say it's supposed to be, you're just supposed to, go with that. And you're supposed to be able to think, for yourself, right? That's kind of what college is all about, right? And I know some of that to you sounds like BS, but that in fact is what the college academic experience is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about regurgitation. It's supposed to be about independent thinking. So, okay. Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. As a reminder, we do not meet tomorrow. Your class has already been canceled by the university. From 2 to 4:30, there are no classes on campus. There are no Zoom classes. There are supposed to be no classes of any kind, because of the inauguration and installment of the new president for Loyola, Maryland. So there is no, we don't meet. And even though several of you have sent me emails asking, I have been saying since last Tuesday that we don't meet. I've said it in announcements. I've said it in the recordings I did for week 5. I'm saying it here. We do not meet on Tuesday, October the 11th. Some of you will probably come to class anyway. Some of you might even send me emails, Susan, going, "Why aren't we meeting?" And I'm kind of like, well, haven't, please pay attention. That's what I'm just going to say that and not say anything else before I piss off somebody. But, I don't really like having to constantly repeat myself on something that I've been saying for about a week now. So, anyway, there's that too. So, anyhow. But the bulk of what I want to focus on today. Oh, yeah, there's one other thing before I even get to that. Some of you in the last few weeks, as more and more of you have had questions about your writing assignment, questions about what's going on in the course, have had to miss, whatever, have been violating my space. One of the things I asked you to do, both in the syllabus and in person, the first couple days of class, is to make sure that when you come talk to me, that you keep 6 feet worth of distance, 2 meters worth of distance. And some of you have not been doing that. Some of you have just walked right up to me as if everything is normal and I'm not wearing a mask and everything's okay. You just want to talk. And I do want to talk to you. It's not that I don't. I want you to come to my office hours too, but I have certain guidelines in terms of my space, and that is, please stay 6 feet away. You know, and if you're going to come to my office, I'm probably going to, if you don't have a mask, I'm going to give you one. If you have a mask, that's great, because I'd prefer if you wear one in my office, right? Kind of thing. You know, but please do that. Just maintain some space between me and you. That's all I'm asking you to do. There's very few things that you need to come straight up to me to give me. If you need me to sign something for athletes at the beginning of the semester, that's one thing. But just to ask me questions, to read something to me, that kind of thing, you can stay 6 feet away. It's not that hard. Okay? So there's that. So anyway, most of what I'm talking about now is about week 6. The stuff that we're going to miss week 6 because we're not going to have class tomorrow. So I'm trying to summarize as much of week 6 as I possibly can. And week 6 basically comes down to the colonial America becoming the United States, and with it becoming the U.S., the contradictions between why the U.S. wants to become another country and, separate from the British Empire, and the realities of having this system of slavery come to light, right? It was, don't get me wrong, people have always seen the contradictions, right? People coming to the U.S. for what's now the U.S. for religious freedom, and yet enslaving people. People who came to the U.S. for political freedom, and yet enslaving people. People came here, period, for freedom because they'd been in jail, they'd been in prison, and yet enslaving people, right? With the excuse that these people really aren't people. Well, of course, we know the whole story of the U.S. I mean, if you've listened to Schoolhouse Rock or watched any sort of, civics type of movies, they're, Brave, not Braveheart, The Patriot and all that other stuff. The U.S. basically breaks free because no taxation without representation and so on and so forth. And that's all fine and good. But I'm here to tell you, as someone who studies African American history, as someone who is an African American scholar, someone who has read other African American scholars and knows other African American scholars, that our interpretation of that period is really terms of elite whites, and how elite white males, people, many of whom were slave owners or some participation in either transatlantic slave trade, shipping that involved having enslaved Africans as shipwrights and sailors and other folks, loading and unloading stuff on docks, to, folks who were bankers, but involved in stock and trade, and yet they're trading shares. They had loans to slave owners. They had loans to folks to buy land who would eventually buy slaves. Slaves were traded literally as stock on stock exchanges, that kind of thing. To see that those people would be the ones calling for freedom from tyranny, from the British Empire, because of because they challenged the right of Parliament to actually tax them at all. Whether it was a tea tax, a sugar tax, a coffee tax, a stamp act, or whatever we're talking about. They challenged them just on the basis of that. Not only did they challenge them, they argued for the right for representatives from British colonial America to be part of Parliament is on equal footing with folks in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, particularly the House of Lords, the upper chamber, which now has no real say over anything in the House of Commons, right, by the way, but then had a lot of say, right? And they wanted the equivalent status of Lords on the other side of the Atlantic, which the British refused to give them. So that's really the bottom line behind. There are triggers that lead to U.S. To the Continental Congress declaring independence from the UK in 1776, certainly, right? The occupation of Massachusetts and declaring martial law in the Massachusetts colony, the battles of Lexington and Concord of 1775, those kinds of things, right? There are triggers here, the Boston Tea Party, all of that. But overall, these elites wanted the same status as the elites on the other side of the Atlantic, who also were benefiting from the slave trade, who also were benefiting from the production of goods and resources coming from Western Hemisphere and going to the UK, who had made themselves rich off slave trade and off of slavery themselves, right? They wanted equal footing with those people, and because those people refused to give them equal footing, they decided that they needed independence, and that led to the American Revolution. Which is why I say, which is why many people say, that the American Revolution was never a social revolution. It was not a revolution to overturn the social order, to basically flip it on its head. It wasn't that kind of revolution. It was basically a political revolution where the elites who are already running things on this side of the Atlantic decided that they wanted to run things fully for themselves without interference from people on the other side. That's all. That's the only thing that changed. They were already on top. They just wanted to be recognized as their own lords. Right? And they did that themselves by declaring independence. So when the U.S. gains independence, I mean, I'll talk about a little bit about what happens once the U.S. gains independence, and through the Treaty of Paris of 1783, right? But in the meantime, African Americans, enslaved black folk, enslaved Africans are caught in the middle, right? If you're free, if you happen to be among the handful, the small minority of free blacks, particularly up north, you might fight. You might be Christmas addicts and be fighting fighting against tyranny from the UK. That's fine, right? Because British Empire was tyranny when it came to a lot of things, particularly if you happen to be black, right? So why not fight for freedom? Because there might be the promise of freedom for you and your people. And so there are definitely um, enslaved Africans who were fighting on the side of the Continental Congress, and even before that, free blacks like Crispus Attucks, who believed in the concept of freedom and democracy and equality that these revolutionaries are espousing. On the other hand, particularly once the revolution hits, and the revolution and the war that comes with it moves to the southern colonies, moves to the Carolinas, moves to Georgia. But once that happens, the British are promising enslaved Africans freedom if they fight on their side. And so, some of are forcibly recruited, others are not. You end up with something like 25,000 enslaved Africans and free blacks fighting on both sides of the American Revolution, right? Fighting on both sides. And so, caught in the middle of all of this. And so, you've got folks on one side, like, talking about freedom and all that other stuff. I mean, even before the revolution, people like the great Phyllis Wheatley, writing poetry about freedom and how great it is to be free from the tyranny and degradation of living in sub-Saharan Africa kind of stuff on the one hand, but also realizing that it ain't no picnic here on this side of the Atlantic being enslaved either, right? So there's that. And let's be honest, if there's constant warfare going on, as part of the transatlantic slave trade, you can't say there's no tyranny going on in parts of Africa south of the Sahara either. So there's some truth to what she's saying. One of the things I plan on giving out, by the way, is Phyllis Wheatley's poems at some point, but I guess we're not going to do that right now. So there's that. So both sides. Some enslaved blacks do gain freedom as a result of the end of the American Revolution, because the British take some of them with them to the Caribbean, to Canada, to other parts. But so many of these enslaved blacks end up back in slavery after the end of the Revolution because the British don't fulfill their promises. Who knew, right? Who knew that, an empire that was still very much steeped in slavery wasn't going to honor their word after they, essentially decided that they weren't going to try to, to completely conquer their 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic in North America, right? They had enough to deal with Canada, with the Caribbean. So, not great. And yes, some enslaved blacks ended up gaining their freedom as a result, because some people did honor honor them. Some slave owners did honor the folks who fought with them in the revolution by freeing them. But again, we're talking a few thousand here and a few thousand there. We're maybe, maybe 10,000 out of the 25 or 30,000 blacks who are part of on both sides of the American Revolution. So not great. And then, when the Articles of Confederation, which were signed in 1781 to run the country, fall apart because you've got, too many head honchos and not enough people to run things, right? Because everyone wants to declare their state sovereign. Because technically speaking, once the colonies are free, they're all their own individual nation states. We use the word states to say, but they're nation states at this point, and they're nation states who've decided that they are part and parcel of a confederation, but it's not federalized, right? Which means they can all make their own treaties, they can all do their own stuff, and it doesn't really matter. But they decided to come together to form a constitution, to form a federal government, because it's too hard for each state to make their own treaties. It's too hard for each state to make their own tariffs and create their own money and all those other things. So they wanted to centralize things. And one of the issues that would come up during the course of this time frame around what the federal government role would be in different things was slavery. They spent a goodly portion of their time between May of 1787 and September 17th of 1787 trying to figure out what to do about this issue of the transatlantic slave trade and do about slavery. That's the main theme within all of this, right? What to do about it. Some states already set up a process for manumitting their slaves, like the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1780, even before the Revolution was actually over, started granting freedom to slaves who would reach the age of 28 by such and such a time on such and such a date, meaning that they would still have slavery, but as their population of enslaved Africans got older, say they hit the age of 28, they would become free. They also put a clause in there that said if someone moved to their state with enslaved people who were of a certain age, over the age of 18, could be free within 6 months of moving to the state, right? Which basically made the population of free blacks in the state of Pennsylvania skyrocket. Even by the time of 1787, there are more than 6,000 free blacks living in Philadelphia alone. So it's a place of freedom. New York State doesn't adopt a similar law until 1800. Connecticut doesn't adopt a similar law until somewhere around 1790 or so, to give you some sense of what we're talking about. So there's already debate within this around what to do about enslaved folks. And that debate basically leads to a debate about things regarding whether they're human beings in the first place. Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia in 1782, basically writes that blacks are not the equal of white people. And in fact, he doesn't see them as human and doesn't think that they have a soul. This, as he's about to conduct an affair with Sally Hemings, this is within few years of this, he is sleeping with Sally Hemings as essentially his mistress or concubine, whatever terminology you want to use, right? And so he's saying all that on the verge of that. And so you've got this debate. You've got folks who are Quakers in Pennsylvania, and the Quakers since 1711 have officially adopted an anti-slavery stance. They were against slavery and segregation of Africans as human beings, and they saw Africans as human beings, and the degradation of white people, and the illusion of having so much power and wealth, and having that and basically becoming beasts to slavery as themselves. So you had Quakers who were arguing against slavery. You had Southern slaveholders who definitely didn't want to give up the institution. You had the couple who did, but most of them didn't. You had folks who were prospering from the slave trade as bankers, as lawyers, as stockbrokers, as ship magnates, folks who were in shipping industry who were saying let's not end this, and back and forth they went. And so one of the compromises they came up with is the end of the the international importation of slaves as part of one of the articles within the Constitution. That would end 20 years hence by December, the end of the day on December the 31st, 1807, right? That's the one thing they did adopt. So they would, but it was a meaningless adoption of a law because, as we well know, you know, chattel slavery was self-sustaining in the states, right? Through rape, through impregnation, through the codifying of the wombs of enslaved black women as property. Any any child born of them would be enslaved anyway. And since conditions were more ripe for them to be able to have these childbirths, whether consensual or not, it meant that you didn't need to import that many slaves. Still, nearly 100,000 more slaves were imported from parts of West Africa between 1787 and 1807. Between 1787 and 1807, about 100,000 additional ones were imported. So, give you some idea of how many more came to the States after that. So there's that. There's the Three-Fifths Compromise to basically limit Southern political power by treating slaves as if they're three-fifths of a person. You can come to that easy conclusion when you don't see them as human beings to begin with. So, it wasn't decided that they were literally three-fifths of a person, though. That's too much of a literal reading. It's more about states that were beginning the process of manumitting their enslaved folk who decided that they didn't want the South to have as much political power. So instead of treating these people as whole people, we compromised and said three-fifths, right? It implies that they see them as enslaved blacks as three-fifths of a person, to be sure. But the record, if you were to actually read a record from them, they're not literally saying they're three-fifths. Okay, that's a minor quibble, I know, but I just want to make sure that that's clear. But sort of what also comes out of this period, this early period, in terms of the contradictions, is the fact that if you don't think of folks as human, if you don't think of folks as being anything but property, you wouldn't be doing these negotiations the way you're doing it. Three-fifths of a person, it's in the slave trade, that sort of thing. So, so there's that. And the truth of the matter is that when the Constitution's set up and when civil rights, voting rights are specifically set up, they're set up to benefit elite whites. Half the folks who signed off on the Declaration of Independence and signed off on the Constitution 1787, 11 years later, more than half of them are slave owners. The other half are mostly benefiting from slavery. And they're primarily the group that they gear the Constitution for. The only people who can vote in 1788 for George Washington are propertied white males over the age of 21. 6% of the population is allowed to vote, right? So it's not much of a representative democracy. It's a representative democracy for their large House of Lords. That's basically it. It's an oligarchy and a plutocracy that's not really a democracy. So if they're treating other white people like that, imagine what they really think about black folk, right? Both in terms of their humanity and their lack of humanity. And then finally, the other thing that comes out that's not directly related to the Constitution, but is related to the contradictions of thought, is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, which basically requires people to turn in runaway slaves who've stolen their own bodies and gone to other parts of the country where slavery either doesn't exist very much or doesn't exist at all. The law becomes stronger in 1850, but it's the first law passed specifically to basically inculcate every white person in the country into slavery, to make every white person sort of the Gestapo for slavery. And so that's really the bulk of what I would have talked about this week, specifically on Tuesday. So we'll talk more about this in summary on Thursday, but that's the bulk of it.